Good morning, everybody. We decided, Ilona, she's from Brazil, I'm from Mexico, but we decided to speak in English. So if, basically what we want to do here, I will I will make a sort of an interview of Ilona. Ilona has been working on liberalizing drugs, I will put it that way.
Don't say like that. I'll explain.
You'll explain?
You put me in very difficult situation when you say that.
In decriminalization of drugs for the last 10 years, 12 years.
Yes.
She's been coordinating now the Global Drug Commission of the UN, but that's something that really started as a Latin American initiative. It was really Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. Three former presidents, Cardoso, Cedillo, and Gaviria, working on this. And they've really been the force behind this effort to try to end with this regime of drugs. That it's that is a punitive regime that is being, we believe in Latin America, very costly for us. My name is Rafael Fernández de Castro. I'm here because well, I've been coming to these meetings for many years now, but also because I worked for President Calderón. I was his foreign policy advisor, and because I coordinated the last UNDP report on citizen security. That's how I met Ilona. And so Ilona, where are we? I mean, there's been a long process. Latin America has been pushing for this since the late 80s, especially in the 1990s. And finally, last April, we have the UN host a global conference on gas.
Yes.
And the resolution is quite something. So why don't we start by you telling us where we are and what else Latin America can do to have, I would say, a more efficient system, regulation for drugs?
Sure. So good morning, everyone. And I think because we're in Colombia, this is very symbolic, and a little bit of background, I think it's interesting because this region is really where everything is happening in terms of not only political intents to transform drug policy, but also practical experiments. And I'm saying Latin America, but also the Americas as a whole. So as Rafael has said, I think it's important to say that in 2008, as a civil society group, because in fact the commissions that I've been working with, they are independent commissions. So it was just led by three former presidents that were questioning themselves because drugs, they saw that at that time we were not clear that it was drug policy, it was drugs are really jeopardizing, are putting our democracies at risk. So are corrupting our institutions, or just the levels of violence are absolutely out of control. So we need to do something about it. But in our first meeting in Rio de Janeiro 2008, when this group got together, it was more to say, you know, we need a war on drugs. I mean, there was nothing to do with what you're going to see in this report. So we, in 8 years of work and of really going around, and this commission that started as a Latin American commission became a global commission in 2011. So we've been researching, visiting, and including, I mean, in our policies and in our reports, I mean, every single experience in the world, what worked, what hasn't worked, and all the evidence that is available. So there's a lot of evidence missing, but so far I think we are at the point that we can say that we should never have just dealt with drugs as a criminal issue. I mean, if now we created an apparatus and they're going to have to deal with that, but drugs are a health issue. And if we had faced that long ago, we would not have the problems we have today. So I think this is an important saying that we didn't start there. We got to this after a lot of, I would say, a lot of research and a lot of also like doubt, right? Because in this way, in this pathway, you question yourself many times because it's so against the common sense, so against what we were taught, that we have to be quite bold to launch this report in 2014, and I'm going to talk about it. But where are we today? So in this process, since 2008, I think a landmark was when we got out of the civil society movement. So these global commissions is composed by former presidents, Richard Branson, Kofi Annan, people that never spoke about drugs, but when they did speak about drugs, people stopped to just listen to them because basically, you know, like, what are these people talking about drugs? And this generated also that like sitting presidents could be more, I would say, free to talk about drugs because it's such a taboo that it's almost impossible. Everyone says, but now you're a former president, you're talking about this. Well, because sitting presidents have political costs. But in this country, it's very symbolic and very important to talk about this because it was President Santos together at that time with the president of Guatemala and Mexico that asked for the anticipation of this UN session that just happened in April. It was 2012. It was in the America Summit. And they just said, to 2019 was the next day to have this global conversation. It's too far away. Our region needs to talk about this before. So it just happened in New York on April 2016. And what happened there is that the whole process was, as it's always is, civil society, in terms of drug policy, the UN is very closed until even the on gas. The process was closed. It was hard. There was like very limited possibilities of really inputting, and we were kind of blind on the negotiations, not knowing who were the spoilers, knowing but not knowing officially. But I think the biggest thing that happened there is that for the first time, the countries, if you see the discourses from President Santos, from Canada, from the United States, from Uruguay, from Mexico, you will just see the report. It's just like, it's so much more advanced. All of them recognized, and this is our region, by the way, because the eastern part of the world hasn't quite yet got that we failed in the war, because the war on drugs is not on drugs, it's on people. We've been trying this for a while, and but our region recognized in most countries, there are some that are still not so outspoken, but most countries just recognize that first, we paid immense cost. So we cannot just continue doing what we're doing. So first, we do need to decriminalize the use of drugs. And this is not new. There are over 30 countries in the world that do this. And Latin America and mainly South America, many countries have never criminalized drugs. So for personal use. These were saying drugs are still illegal because the UN conventions, they still keep them as illegal, but the use and the user are not put in prison. So this is the first step of what we say, turning into a criminal justice approach to a health approach. You gotta just separate the user from the drug trafficker. So this is, I would say, a first recommendation that it's quite, I would say, wide accepted now. So there's not a lot of question there. And I would say in our region, in Europe, I think that's something that we have to go. And the main fear about decriminalizing, for those that didn't do this step yet, is that consumption would increase and that children would have access to drugs. In fact, there are three only arguments that I always see coming back all the time that we talk about this, which is consumption will increase, children will have access, and the health system will collapse. When you see what happened in countries that decriminalized or even went further, which we're going to talk about, that regulated or that have some kind of mixed policies which are not actually in the law but are in the practice, none of these things happened. And in fact, what happened is that we could see that young people got more difficulty, to get access to drugs, which is the first, I would say, the first goal we have in a drug policy today, like a modern drug policy, is just to say we need to prevent, we have to delay use as much as possible and prevent use. But ultimately, try to really allow people not to abuse, because you're going to tell your kids, do not do drugs, but they need to know if they decide to do, what are drugs, what they can cause, and how can they ask for help, because ultimately that's what you want. So when you think about a system when drugs are not a criminal offense anymore, you need to educate people on how to deal with drugs. And that's how many European countries did, and there was not catastrophic. You see Portugal, there are people from Portugal here, you see the Netherlands, you see Czech Republic, you see Spain. Spain even went further. There's like cannabis clubs everywhere. I'm gonna explain what is this. Belgium. So,
But what about Uruguay?
Yeah, I mean, we're gonna get to regulation because I think it's very important. But to build the argument, I think because we didn't get to regulation today, because regulation is ultimate the answer that we're gonna have to face and discuss. So I think today we got the very clear that consumption, get out of the criminal justice system, improve the health provisions. And when you come to health, which is the second point that we defend very hard, it's not that one size fits all. You gotta give people treatments that you gotta have a range of treatments to offer. So there are treatments that are, I mean, from like more intense. There are others that will be what we call harm reduction, which is something also that most countries call that on gas, countries from our region and from Europe, but at the outcome document, because it's so controversial to the Eastern countries, it didn't come. So what I'm saying, I mean, it's important to say that the UNGAS in the discourse and on the debate was very, I mean, it was a landmark meeting, but in the outcome document, none of these points that we're discussing here actually entered, because there was very, I mean, a lot of resistance from Russia, from China, from Middle East, from Southeast Asia. So, but for our region, when you see all the presidents' discourses, you see where we are at in the thinking and the way to go. So health, of course, we need to think about that, because it's not that demand doesn't exist or that the health system will face a collapse. It's that the demand is hidden today. We have a lot of people that just simply do not get good care. And what they get is like goodwill of people, but what we have in our region is something called the broad treatment that we have is called therapeutic communities, and most of them are not evidence-based. They are like dealt by sometimes religious and so on. So we need to just think how to offer treatment in an evidence-based scale, and we have these answers. In Europe, there is like plenty of answers there.
Yeah, but you're talking about Europe. You're giving those examples. You're right. I was mistaken when I used the word liberalization, because if you want to go with a health system, and if you want to go to a comprehensive approach of drugs, you have to have a strong state. You have to have strong institutions, and that is the problem with Latin America. I mean, what we're talking about here in decriminalizing drugs is you have to have a strong regulator to do this. So is Latin America ready to be a good regulator? Do we have the institutions to regulate drugs? Because it seems to me that on that, if there's something common among us Latin Americans is that we have very weak institutions, especially those in procurement of justice. So, I mean, what is your reaction to this? Do we have the institutions in place?
I think if we think about our criminal justice and health, I think we're much better on the health front than in the criminal justice front. So what happens today is that we regulate a lot of things, by the way. I mean, we regulate drugs because the issue on illicit and licit is, it's not evidence-based again. What is in the prohibition, in the prohibit list is not, sometimes as dangerous as alcohol and as other drugs that are regulated. We regulate firearms, we regulate, so there are problems in regulation, but they're not, firearms is another example that, I'm not going to enter there, but it's something to talk about. But explosives...
That has become a very hot issue.
Yeah, and we work with that as well, but that's another issue brief next time. So I think that the biggest thing for us is that who do you prefer, and if I can say very honestly, today, who regulates drugs are criminal organizations. And because they do, it's a lack of regulation, but, anybody can have it with the quality that nobody cares. At any age you can buy and in any place, because from schools to prisons, okay? So to be very honest, today what we have is the free-for-all market, but in the hands of the wrong people. So this, I think we need to be clear, it's the truth. Unfortunately, that's the truth. And parents, let's face it, it's the truth. So what we want is that we actually put this just, below the law. And we are going to have to face several questions because it's not, again, one size fits all. Each drug would need to be regulated depending on the degree of damage. And some will be regulated under the health system. Some will be regulated on something we call harm reduction, which is trying to get people away from it. And some will be legally, like even market regulated. In our approach to regulation, we really do not want that to be like a Colorado style, and I'll tell you why. Because there are today some examples of regulation. So countries that actually are breaking the convention are Uruguay, because the conventions of drug, they do not allow countries to regulate. They allow countries more or less with some kind of pain to decriminalize. We can do a lot of things in this way. You can, do continue doing the policies that are going to lead us to the biggest questions. But when it comes to regulation, countries are actually breaking conventions, and this has a political cost, and that's why, for example, the Netherlands, that's why they don't legalize marijuana. But you go to a coffee shop and you buy legally there, but the guy that owns the coffee shop buys it illegally. So, and they say it's better to regulate it halfway than all, and we're doing what we can according to the international system, so they're being very pragmatic. But, that's not the full answer. The full answer, first country that faced it was Uruguay. Now we're going to have a big country facing it, Canada, and we have 4 American states and coming many more, including California, which will just transform the whole industry. So referendum in California right this year.
Yeah, now that you touch on the U.S., let me get your reaction on this. Seems to me that Washington is still not the same page that some of us countries in Latin America. For example, I do believe that Washington, at the national level, at the federal level, the number one goal when they cooperating with Latin America in terms of violence, security, is about interdiction, especially with Mexico. It's about the Mexican violence not coming into the U.S. territory. It's about narcotics not coming into the U.S. territory.
Yeah.
And for Latin America, for Mexico, for Guatemala, for El Salvador, the number one goal should be citizen security, should be to have safe parks for our children, should be that our children could walk to school. That, of course, that's impossible nowadays in Mexico City or in Guatemala or in El Salvador, or I don't know, in Medellin, they say that it's much safer here than in the past, but still, we have a big problem of security and violence in Latin America. But it seems to me that Washington at the federal level continues to play this and be very interested in making sure that drugs doesn't come into the U.S., do not come into the U.S. territory. So how's Washington, and how you see, now that we have perhaps the most unprecedented election in the U.S., yeah. How you see Washington now under Obama, no doubt, he's a progressive president, and that's why we've seen Trump and his followers. In a way, we can explain Trump because there's a lot of people very mad in the U.S. because of the progressiveness of Obama. He's been doing, no other president, but since Lyndon Johnson, has done so much to try to help society, to try to help poor Americans. So there's, I would say, a movement against him. So how you see Washington evolving in terms of drugs, and don't you think that we, I haven't heard how Donald Trump, what is he thinking about drugs? I know that Hillary Clinton will be, I will say, she'll be a very mature president. When she was Secretary of State, I remember vividly, she came to Cartagena, the last summit of the Americas, and she was very well seen there. She's someone who understands Latin America. She's someone who gets Latin America. She wasn't as John Kerry, which is I will say, the essential American diplomat who is very interested in the Middle East or Europe, but not so much Latin America. But tell me how you see Washington, and after that we will open for your questions and comments. Please,
sure.
Ilona.
I think the U.S. also has a lot of, I would say, discussion internally, because internally Obama quietly has been doing, I would say, the biggest criminal justice reform ever. And he's trying to dismantle what was created with all these very tough laws on drugs. So he's been also giving pardon to hundreds of people that are arrested for like very long time on drug offenses. So there is this side, and also, for example, you know, we met recently the youngest mayor of the U.S. from Ithaca, New York. He's opening a consumption room in the models that they have in Europe for heroin-assisted programs in the state of New York. How, I mean, where could you just think that this would happen in time? So the U.S. internally, you know, with 4 states that already regulated marijuana, dozens that have medical marijuana and decriminalized personal use, with a huge reform on criminal justice side. So he didn't take this issue as his issue, for example, as gun control, because I think gun control was already too controversial for him then to face drug policy reform. We tried hard, I have to say, to get him involved with the president and so on. But he gave the signs that, you know, let it go. The best thing he just allowed was the states to do, to experiment. Because ultimately what we want is to experiment with new solutions, to get out of the straitjacket and responsibly see what works and what doesn't. And each country will have to find a solution tailored for their reality. But when it comes, I think, from Hillary, Hillary signed a document with all this proportionality and decriminalization, health. So she's very much on the page. Trump, I mean, he's an entrepreneur, he's a businessman. I would say that he's probably not in the other side now, but he wouldn't say that because, you know, he's really praying for the conservatives. But I don't think this would be a flag because he has so many others to fight. But I think the U.S. is not anymore, I would say the biggest control they have is over Central America and the Caribbean. And of course, these countries are still suffering the international policy because how to dismantle like the DA, how to dismantle these huge institutions. And it's not to dismantle, but how to recreate them to another drug policy, one that works, one that actually is worried about people's health, safety first, right? So that's what we're aiming.
You touch on a very important issue. It will be very difficult to change the culture of some of the American institutions. I mean, you're talking about the dismantling the Drug Enforcement Administration. I don't think that's happening soon. So it's, I mean, we still have a long way to go.
Yes.
But let me now open it up for questions, for your comments. Just identify yourselves, be brief, and let me know who want to participate.
And please ask hard questions.
Yes, here.
Oh, sorry. Roberto Peckham, Medellin Herald. Could you give like 2 or 3 key points of an ideal drug legislation?
So I think when it comes for what we can do today, because there is a big fight. I mean, we're not talking about the international regime here because it's for diplomats and so on, but there's a big fight of what we can do and what we can't under these conventions. I think there's a lot to advance. So first, really end the criminalization of drug users and try to get to not only get, I would say, very objective criteria to separate, but try also to get a way out for the small petty dealers that are not dangerous for the society. Because what we have today, it's a whole region with overpopulated prisons of very poor, generally minorities, as we call minorities, but black people are not minorities in my country, for example, and they are over, you know, like they are there. And, you know, Brazil today is like with the 4th prison population in the world driven by drug offenses. You know, women are 70% in prison because of drug offenses. And if you see throughout this region, that's more or less the rate. So end the criminalization and get an alternative sentencing for the small dealers. Really invest in change the budget line. It's not to create more money. It's actually less money to treat than to imprison. So give people offers of treatment. And this is also, again, very based on what we know. There is from this harm reduction, which is just simply do not demand abstinence, like let people get out of drugs their way, and this happens. People can be functional and still consume. We have to also agree that the ideal is not what we want for ourselves. Some people will have other situations. So do invest in treatments that are evidence-based. Fight criminals, fight hard, but fight their money. Look at money laundering. The best way is like stop fighting these wars, stop killing everybody, focus on intelligence deterrence. I mean, the way to go on fighting cartels or criminal organizations is going after their money. That's the only way we're going to actually jeopardize this network. So this is, and this is what should be at first. I mean, we should be doing that and not going after the poor people that are suffering all the consequences. But finally, we do need to face the questions of regulation. And this is not difficult with marijuana. This is not difficult for synthetic drugs because most of them, if produced at a I would say, controlled environment, they could be quite safe, to be honest, if people know what are the harms. The problems are heroin, cocaine, how we're going to do this. And we have to talk about this. We don't have the answers. The Global Commission doesn't preach the answers to people. But if we don't sit down and think that, people do want to consume drugs, and this is from the history of our humanity, and only a part of them will get dependent. So the rate of dependency on drugs is around 10 to 12% worldwide. Some drugs have a higher percentage of people that get dependent to them, some have less, but none goes beyond 40, 50%. So how to think about these hard drugs in a way that, we don't have the criminal market just holding them and making all this. So this is, I think, the questions that what's next, Rafael? Otherwise, we won't get out of the problem. And fight smart, fight crime smart. Stop killing people, just go after their money, and they're going to start just getting them out. And of course, drugs come together with guns and other illicit markets. So it's very, today we have data. It's just, let's cross this data. Let's get these guys, but in a much more intelligent way.
Thank you. There's another question coming here.
Mirano from El Diario de Hoy in El Salvador. The problem, with all due respect, is not the petty criminal. The problem are the politicians who come into office financed by the drug money. In countries like El Salvador, in countries like Guatemala, in countries like Honduras, there's an enormous amount of evidence that politicians are basically coming into office financed because of money laundering. And my point is that specifically the institutions, the governmental institutions and the media institutions are much too weak in small countries like El Salvador to combat these. Can there be a supra entity that polices the coming in of politicians into the scenery financed by the drug cartels?
If you
Yeah, sure.
In Mexico, and I would say everywhere, we're very worried about the increase of violence in El Salvador. We have now, perhaps this year, we're going to have in Mexico between 300,000 and 400,000 of migrants in transit. Most of them coming from what we call the Northern Triangle of Central America, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And they come in, and I call that the Syria of Latin America. Because basically we have a similar violence in Central America that the one we face in Syria. We have similar economic problems. There's no future, especially for young people there. Young people in El Salvador, they killing each other. It's very sad to see that. So I would say that's why I talked about institutions. And seems to me that in international cooperation, we're still very shallow. It is very hard to go about international cooperation because the US still trying to interdict. And for us, it's about citizen security. It's about youngsters. It's about youth in Latin America. So, I take this very seriously. Seems to me that El Salvador, Honduras especially, the two most violent countries on earth without declared war, they badly need the cooperation of the rest of Latin America and the US. And you're right, there's something we should do there, and this is not only about drugs, but it goes beyond that. It's about institutions. So sorry, Ilona.
No, perfect.
Now, so drugs is one part of it, but it's not all of it. And in the end, what we Latin Americans do, and El Salvador is very much the case, is about strong institutions. It's about good police, good judges, good prosecutors, and good prisons. And all of us in Latin America, we have a problem in prisons. In El Salvador, for instance, they have, they have 300% capacity in the prisons. It's the condition, the living conditions of a prisoner in El Salvador is just beyond imagination. So we have a big problem there. Ilona, you have the last words. They're telling me that we have 2 minutes. So
Sure. So just to get to your question, I think that it's the same. I mean, when we want to see international cooperation on money laundering, we see. I mean, my country today, all countries are cooperating. And banks are getting also, more aware that we have to do something together. So for me, the way to go and also the political involvement in this market is to go track the money. And in this field, cooperation is possible. It's easier than in exchanging police data. So, and I just want to end because if we don't face these questions, we have Latin America, 8% of the world's population, 33% of the world's murders. We have so many people dying here every year. And it's not all about drugs, but drugs plays a very big role on this. We have a prison population that is absolutely unsustainable, and the conditions are not so bad only in El Salvador, it's everywhere. So, and we have young kids that do not have information, and they do not know how to ask for help if they get in a bad situation with drugs. And we rather them seeing the doctor than seeing the police. So, let's just continue these conversations, but facing the reality, we need to find solutions to put governments, even if they're weak, under control. On the control of the drug issue. So, a lot to discuss further, but thank you very much.
And let me finish by saying that I believe that here at the World Economic Forum, it's important that we understand that to face this huge problem of violence that we have in Latin America, it's not only about the state, but it's also about civil society, and it's very much about business persons. I've been trying to create here a task force of business persons to think about what is the role of the business sector in terms of in helping solve the violence, which has become the number one problem throughout Latin America, and we have not yet got that task force going on. So, well, thank you, Ilona, and thank you all for being here. Very good.